So this news came out on Friday when I was at the hospital, and then someone had showed me, one of the nurses had showed me that New York Presbyterian had just mandated. So it was like right before the end of the business day, and then the news came out that New York Presbyterian was going to be mandating all of their employees to now, of course, take the vaccine. So you can either take it or you can be fired or leave. And this is very similar outcome for many of the medical workers in Methodist Hospital in Texas. Now, a lot of people claim that, of course, Texas is free, and every day, you know, Governor Abbott would go online onto Twitter and say we have X amount of people vaccinated, you know, but of course is always by, you know, always of your own will, never forced, right? That was one of the things that he had been touting for so long. And then, of course, this happens right in the heart of Texas. And so it just goes to show you that despite being supposedly free, that we see that is quite the opposite. Now, this has always been my stance, that has absolutely nothing to do with the virus, right? Because the numbers just don't show it, despite, of course, New York Presbyterian touting that this is the right thing to do, and that everybody who takes the poke, you know, you're going to be just fine. And of course, that hasn't been the case. I've shown multiple videos, and of course, maybe you have seen yourself where many of these individuals have taken it and have had adverse effects.
Yeah, and it's video that just takes your breath away, in part because it was captured by two high-definition surveillance camera, two different angles on the action. And, well, let's just throw this in. The COVID vaccine may be a factor.
The video is startling. Two men barely escaping as a pickup smashes into a boat on a trailer attached to a truck in front of Top Shop Automotive and Marine in Lynn. One of them is the owner, Ken Broussard, who never moved faster in his life. The truck first hits an SUV parked maybe 30 feet away. That may have saved Ken's life. He says it sounded like an explosion.
When I heard an explosion from behind me, turned around, that's when he was just clearing the white car.
Right.
And I jumped out of the way as quickly as I could, and the customer was running as fast as he could.
In slow motion, you can see just how narrowly the men escaped disaster. The truck was still running after the crash, the driver unconscious behind the wheel. Several people, including a UPS driver who had stopped nearby, were able to smash the window with a hammer and get the keys. At that point, the driver woke up and got out. He was dazed, but not hurt, and said he was headed home from getting his COVID vaccination and thinks that's what knocked him out.
The last thing he remembered was he felt like he was going to pass out. And so he tried to pull over, and then the next thing he knew, we were smashing his window.
Needless to say,
No doubt about that. The boat and the trailer ended up wrapped around that telephone pole. Now, the police had been called to the scene, and they tell us that driver told them the same thing about the COVID vaccine, him having a reaction to it. Although at this point, no charges have been filed.
And of course, if something were to happen, your employer is, of course, not liable for anything, right? So even though if they mandate it, if the government mandated, etc., if something were to happen to you, the only person that you can sue is the actual American people. So you can't sue the hospital for mandating it. You can't sue the government for mandating it. The only people you can sue are your common everyday people. It's the only people that you actually have the authority to sue is the American people. So it says here 72% of hospital workers overall nationwide are fully vaccinated as of Wednesday, according to the data. I'd have to take a look at that data. As far as I had recall, it was like 30 or 40% of medical workers that had no interest in taking the jab. And I know a lot of people at both of the hospitals, as I used to work at New York Presbyterian, which is one of the reasons why I left, because I saw the writing on the wall. It was very obvious. They were pushing the vaccine. They were offering money. They would offer you like little point systems, and of course constantly pressuring people, why don't you take it, why don't you take it, why don't you take it, you should get it. And you constantly see signs of, you know, superheroes and signs of people taking the poke. And I was like, this is just propaganda within the hospital. And then, of course, when you ask them any real hard questions about the data, all you would get was, you know, the generic Q&A, you know, straight back from Pfizer themselves or from Moderna, whichever one that they typically utilized, either the Pfizer or Moderna. And so it says here, so New York Presbyterian Hospital system on Friday became the first health network in New York to require its employees to receive the vaccine. And it says New York Presbyterian, one of the largest systems in the country, informed 48,000 workers that they need to get their first vaccine by September 1st, joining a growing list of healthcare networks nationally issuing similar mandates. And again, they're not responsible if you have an adverse effect. If you die, it's not their problem. They say, well, you volunteered for it, even though it was either take it or get fired. And of course, information like this is typically downplayed, either on the mainstream media, where it goes on to say here, it says, Marsha and I waited a while to share, but we want other parents and friends to make an educated decision. Isaiah, 18, received his second dose of Pfizer dose on April 30th, and within 48 hours had a heart attack. It was diagnosed with myocarditis, and this is the young man here being assessed either by a doctor or by a nurse. And so a lot of this information kind of gets downplayed, like, oh, it's so very few and far between. It's do the right thing, survive your heart attack, hopefully. And if you're a young person who has like almost next to no chance of actually, becoming infected and getting sick, etc. But these are the people that they're willing to basically sacrifice so that they can meet their quota. And it's crazy that hospitals and healthcare practitioners are pushing this thing despite the fact. And of course, a lot of this, like I said, gets downplayed. Individuals aren't really fully aware of what the outcome, and again, because it really doesn't matter, because whether or not they told you what the outcome could be doesn't matter, because you can't sue anybody, because everybody is immune from liability. And of course, that is never a scenario that is to your benefit. The hospital system includes Lawrence Hospital in Bronxville and Hudson Valley Hospital in Cortlandt Manor, as well as Westchester Behavioral Health Center in White Plains. It says, we care for sick people. It's like, no shit, you're a hospital. Some critically ill, so every day, and we are responsible for their safety while in our care. Now, this has been around since 2020, right? And it's just now, 8 or so months later, when there are literally no cases, according to the data, where cases have dropped to an all-time low, and now they're like, now we can mandate it. So they didn't mandate it when things were out of control. It's like now that there's literally no cases in the hospital, and in fact, most of the cases that I've taken care of are individuals who have been fully vaxxed. The last 5 patients that I've taken care of were all fully vaxxed patients. So it just goes to show you that just because you take it doesn't mean that you're gonna be just fine, right? There was that recent boat, a cruise ship, where some people had tested positive, and then of course there was that family, that 3-person family here in New Jersey, where the whole family had taken it, and it was like a month or 2 later, every single one of them tested positive. Husband ended up in the ICU. So the narrative that, oh well, even though there are going to be some outbreaks, what they refer to, but by all means, it's going to lower your symptoms so that it completely reduces individuals from actually becoming critically ill. And I was like, well, you need to go tell that guy that, because he's laying up in an ICU somewhere with a BiPAP on his face. And it says these stakes in this matter are high, and the evidence is clear. Like getting vaccinated against it is the most important and responsible thing. And then I would say, well, like, if you look at the data, because this is what they say, the data is the most clear, and it says, well, it says, like, this is an article from the Wall Street Journal. It says it's surging, right? C19 surging in the most vaccinated nation. And of course, you see the exact same thing in Chile, right? Chile sees COVID surge despite vaccination success. So even though most of these countries have overwhelmingly vaccinated their people, what they're seeing is actually quite the opposite. They're seeing the opposite. They're like, we had lower cases, right? In where is it? I forget the name of this country. Here we go. In Seychelles, right? They had less cases prior to taking the vaccine. And then they vaccinated like 60%, 63% of their population, and now they have more cases after the fact. Very similar with places like, for example, Chile. In fact, there's an article here, where is it? From Forbes, and I'm like almost tempted to actually pay so I can get a chance to read it. But it says 4 out of the 5 that are the most vaccinated countries are experiencing the biggest surges, and those would be Emirates, Chile, Bahrain, and Seychelles. And the only one that isn't is Israel. Shocker. And it just goes to show you that 4 out of 5, right? 80% of the countries, 80% of the top vaccinated countries are actually seeing surges. So, of course, New York Presbyterian states that the data is clear, and I would say sure is. The data sure is clear about how effective the jab is in terms of lowering cases. As it goes on to say, as the most important and responsible action that we can do as a New York Presbyterian team of members for the safety and the well-being of our patients and our visitors, according to the community. And again, like I've said here, when I go to the local stores now, the local stores here in New York don't require it, right? But they don't have, like, in terms of, they're like, oh, let me see what are your papers? You have papers that show that you're vaccinated? They're like, no, it's on the honor system. Whether I go to the supermarket, whether I go to the gym, if I go here to places like what's it's called, Starbucks. If I go to these places, these different eateries no longer require you. They're like, well, you know, if you didn't take it, then, you know, you should wear a mask. You should still social distance. And I'm like, well, how do I prove that I got it? And they're like, oh, it's an honor system. And so basically what you're telling me is you have all these people basically intermingling with each other. And you have people supposedly who got it, who might not be wearing a mask. I mean, you have no way of telling. And so it just goes to show you that to follow the science is just not, of course, is not what is happening. But in these businesses, of course, for these businesses, they might be feeling some sort of pressure, or who knows if they're getting a kickback from the government. It would not surprise me at all if this was the case. And this just goes to show you that many of these healthcare workers who are frontline workers, especially in places like Texas, where many of these ER nurses, they just weren't going to take it. They were like, we should have the freedom to take it or not, despite what we saw. I mean, when you look at the first wave comparison to the second wave, there is no comparison. You can't compare. The first wave of individuals died within a span of days and were required to be intubated. The second wave of patients, those people lasted months. Now, at least the very good thing is that it says here that they can apply for a medical exemption for either pregnancy or for religious reasons. But more than likely, they're going to force you to show some sort of documentation that your religion specifically states that you can't take vaccines, or they'll just go back and look and be like, well, you took this particular vaccine, why not take this one? Where does your religion differentiate? And so that might be one area where they're going to fight it. And from what I had remembered when I was actually at NYP, it says that NYP will determine whether or not your religious beliefs are actually valid. So they're the ones that make that decision. So you say, I don't take it for religious reasons because I don't want to die. And then they decide whether or not they believe it's a religious exemption or not. And that's when I remember when I saw the religious exemption forms. It says exemption requests will be carefully evaluated and accommodated if appropriate. Right? And like I said. And so like I said in my last video, most of the people, for example, even in the UK, most of the people in the UK who are now testing positive are people who are fully vaccinated. And kind of oddly, it's many young people from the ages of 25 to 29 in the UK are now testing positive. Of course, this is all post-vaccine. And so despite the actual data showing to the contrary that many of these individuals are very oddly getting infected after the case, it just goes to show you that the appeal to the data is typically just narrative. It's just narrative to get people who don't do research, right? If you don't read any of this information, well, they're like, oh, you imagine that the hospital has your best interests at heart. And there we go. New York, it says NYC organizations will get $100 per person who take the poke, right? So it just goes to show you, like, if I bring a buddy and I'm like, hey, why don't you come in? I start propagandizing to people on the street, and I'm like, and I get a group of people, and I'd be like, hey, why don't you guys go take the poke? Well, the city will pay me $100, right? It's a pretty good way during an economic depression where many people, particularly minorities, are feeling the impact. Where the city says, well, we'll give you $100 for each referral. They give you $100 each referral, and of course the limit is 20,000. So you can't get more than 20,000 from the referral program. And it's like, for a disease for a disease so rare, or for a disease so infectious, that you have to be tested to know that you have it, for a vaccine so safe that they got to pay you to take it.